Test, test. Make sure I did everything. See, I'm supposed to, this what, on off there, is that right? Or am I on?
Yeah, you have to get your own.
Is this one on? Test, test. All right, good morning. Good to see everybody. I'm glad we're all thawed out. Hopefully you survived all that without too much extra drama or trouble or all that kind of stuff. It's kind of a crazy few days here. We're talking on the way in. It's like what a difference a few days make. Looks a lot different out there today. All right, so we were trying to wrap up Ecclesiastes today. We got through chapter 11 last week, and so the plan is we'll get through 12 today. If we have some time at the end, we'll kind of go back and maybe try to hit some highlights or some different things, maybe some takeaways from that, but we'll see how fast we can get through this. So last time, chapter 11, the chapter started off where he talked about what we said is practicing charity and benevolence freely, doing it in a way where you're not really looking for a personal return. And if you remember the illustration, he used the illustration of a ship being sent across the seas and to engage in trade. And we talked about, how during that time, when you send a ship out, there were just so many factors and you didn't really know when it would come back, but the hope was it would come back and then return with all the things that it obtained through trading with other places, other countries and things. And so the idea was practice benevolence freely and help will come back to you in your time of need. And then there was also the idea of don't just put all your eggs in one basket, but help freely, help everybody. And he used kind of the example of don't just get into one venture, get into 7 ventures, maybe 8 ventures, and kind of that whole idea of don't limit yourself, but practice benevolence freely and widely. We see this again where Solomon talks about the laws of nature are fixed and they keep operating despite our actions, that despite things we may do, the laws of nature are going to keep going on. We kind of talked about the principle of we can't worry a lot about what we can't control. We don't have control over, I don't know what I was typing there, it must be a typo. Nope, that's me. Control over that. Make good use of opportunities that we have. You remember that he's the example of the fallen tree and the clouds, and it's like, when the clouds are full, it's going to rain, trees are going to fall over, and we're not really going to be able to change that. That's just kind of the way that things work. And we have, it's not something where we need to worry about every weird thing that could happen, every bad possibility that could happen, and find ourselves almost kind of paralyzed where we're not acting or doing anything. So the idea was, we're not going to do the future. We're not going to be able to predict the future. So do the best you can, but do something. We see God's activities in nature, but one cannot know what God does or the activity of God. We manage, but God actually makes. And again, this isn't necessarily anything new, but he kind of keeps reinforcing this in a couple different ways, that we can't understand everything about God. And we have to surrender to the fact that we can't know that, and that really we don't have to know that. That's not essential for us to have to know everything about God or how he operates. And if we try to pretend like we know everything about God, or if we keep pursuing it, he's kind of painted this as that's really kind of the path of foolishness. That's not the path of wisdom. He talks about making the most of your opportunities while you're alive. Enjoy life, but don't forget accountability. And so he spends a lot of time talking about that. He kind of gets across the idea that, life is going to be difficult, and, our circumstances may be rough, our task may be hard, but it's still a good thing to be alive. And that life is meant to be enjoyed rather than simply endured. So make the most of our opportunities while we're alive. Enjoy all the years of life that we're blessed with. And so that's kind of the thought he leaves us with. There was also, he kind of said, try to avoid those things that will hurt us or harm us in either a spiritual or a physical way. And again, he had all the balance in that do all of this in a way that's balanced with the awareness that God's going to bring all of our activities into judgment. So it's not a license to just do anything and everything, but it's saying, enjoy your life, live fully, but do it with a sense of balance, because you are going to be accountable for the things you do. So live it fully in a way that aligns with what God would have you to do. So we actually got into chapter 12 last week, and we got into the first three verses. Just to kind of give us some momentum, I'm going to start there again. We'll go through the first three kind of fast, just to kind of get us back to where we were, and we'll keep kind of going from there. You remember I gave you this caution last week as we get into this first part here of Ecclesiastes. He talks about what it's like to age, and he kind of gets into, he's not sugarcoating, he's just saying, it's not always fun. There's some rough parts of it. And so, chapter 12, let's look at those first three verses. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the days of trouble come and the years approach, when you will say, I find no pleasure in them. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars grow dark, and the clouds return after the rain, when the keepers of the house tremble and the strong men stoop, when the grinders cease because they are few, and those looking through the windows grow dim. And you remember last week we talked about, even though this starts a new chapter 12 versus chapter 11, it's really just a continuation of the same things he's been saying there at the end of verse 11. They just continued them right here into the beginning of 12. And he's been talking specifically to those who are young. And so we talked about, you will remember this last week, we talked about the word creator is definitely a reference to God. It comes from the same kind of root word that's translated in Genesis chapter 1:1, in the beginning God created. It is interesting here that Solomon used the term creator versus, remember your creator versus remember God. And this is the first time that he's actually mentioned God as creator. And I think one of the things we'll see as we go through 12 is Solomon's doing he's referring to some things in a little bit different way in this particular chapter than he's referred to them throughout the rest of the book. So remember, if we think about it in the whole context, he's kind of bringing everything together, and he's working kind of towards wrapping this up and kind of giving his summation or his final thoughts on this. And it is interesting, we'll see some things where, so we kind of get into him talking about judgment, some different things where he's kind of expanded his view a little bit, and we'll see a few different things there. You remember last week we talked about that word remember is not in the sense of don't forget, but it's more, the parallel I think I shared last week was that in 1 Samuel we read about Hannah and how she prayed to God to bless her with a child, and the scripture there says the Lord remembered Hannah. And it's the using the word in the same sense. It's not that God didn't know who Hannah was or he'd forgotten he had to remember. It's just more that he heard her, he acted on her behalf, and allowed her to be able to conceive there. So when we look at this, we think about remembering, we think about more about acting decisively on behalf of someone. So remember your Creator in the days of your youth means act decisively on behalf of the living God. we listen to what he says and act accordingly. He's talking to his audience about a way to live, and reminding them no one's able to escape judgment, and Solomon wanted people to be prepared for this eventually from a very young age. So as he goes through all this and he's laying out this whole course of what's going to happen, he's telling them, be aware of this and live your life accordingly. Before the days of trouble come, maybe your version says, before the evil days come. This is different from what we saw termed as days of darkness that were earlier in chapter 11. I shared last week that the Hebrew in this area is kind of difficult and sometimes gets obscure and ambiguous. It's not always easy for translators to kind of figure out exactly what's going on here, but one of the scholars I read said that maybe the best way to look at this, rather than get kind of caught up in all the exact meanings of things, is just to understand this is kind of a highly poetic picture of the debilities of old age. So whether we know exactly what he meant by some of these things he's getting ready to talk about, the big picture, the message is still clear. I think we can still get that. I find no pleasure in them. He's saying, that the end years of life have lost the pleasure that I had when I was young, or when you're in the prime of life. You don't find pleasure in saying, okay, I'm weaker than I used to be. I'm not as strong as I used to be. I'm losing my eyesight. I'm losing my hearing. I'm losing those things. We don't look forward to a time where it's hard for us to walk, or maybe we can't walk, or we have trouble just even eating or chewing our food. Nobody's looking forward to that. That's what the idea or the picture he's trying to paint. I don't find any pleasure in them or that thought. In verse 2, he starts giving us some examples with light sources there. And the light more than likely represents life. And if you think of kind of the parallel, just like our life slowly, grows towards the grave, so the light diminishes. And if you look at what he used, he started with the sun, the brightest source of light. He goes to the moon, which is the lesser source of light, and then the faintest source of light, the stars. And so it probably represents in his mind kind of how our life goes from childhood, from the prime of life, into those days of trouble. And as he walks through there, each light is finally extinguished, and the darkness, or in this, which represents death, then comes. He makes the comment about the clouds and the rain. Usually we see the clouds and the rain pass, and then the sun comes out after that's over. But here he talks about the clouds returning after the rain. So again, it's a darkened sky. Everything seems to be centered around light and the absence of light here. Some have kind of proposed that maybe what this is pointing to is it's symbolically talking about trouble or the troubles to come. So if we look at the imagery that's used here in verse 2, all the light givers go dark. And the rain doesn't give way to daylight, only to threatening clouds. And so Kidner says, in his mind, this is a scene to bring home to us the general desolations of old age, that age steals our faculties, our senses, our friends, our familiar customs, our long-held hopes. When we're younger, we primarily view troubles and illnesses as setbacks. We don't see them as a disaster. We think, okay, maybe cloudy today, the sky's eventually going to clear, these troubles will eventually go away, we'll get past this season of trouble. But as we enter into the final stretch of life, we face the reality that the sky may not clear. It may not get better. And so he's painting this picture. We get into verse 3, and this is right about where we left off last week. There's not necessarily agreement on the meaning of each symbol, but is consensus that the passage is talking about the frailties of old age and ultimately death itself. I'll share kind of what some of the symbolism, maybe the most common interpretations of the symbolism are, and you can take it for what it's worth. The house might represent the whole person, talking about us, everything about us. And then he talked about the keepers of the house. And that may be referring to like our arms or our hands, the protectors or the guarders of the house. And he'd mentioned that first because that'd be one of the first things you would notice. Your arms, your hands were once capable of defending you and providing for others, and now they no longer can. Now they tremble. The strong men probably represents the legs. The legs that were once the pillars of the house are now bent, they're now stooped. The once mighty men can't walk erectly anymore. The legs are now feeble and struggle to bear the weight of the body. Grinders most likely is talking about the teeth. They stop working. There's probably not a whole lot left. They're probably not situated ideally to chew food or to be able to eat effectively. Some versions may say the maids who grind. Grinding grain would have been the work of the female servants in an affluent household. In later Hebrew, the word here is used for molars, so that's probably why we think it's probably meant to represent teeth. And windows there would probably represent the eyes. The ability to see fades as the light of the sun, the moon, the stars fades away, and at some point it'll be only a memory as they begin to experience total darkness. And so maybe that's what it means. That seems to be the consensus, the more popular interpretations of that. But again, you see at the end of the day, it is pretty easy to see that he is trying to paint a picture of us slowly deteriorating. In verse 4, when the doors to the street are closed and the sound of grinding fades, when people rise up at the sound of birds, but all their songs grow faint, when people are afraid of heights and of dangers in the streets, when the almond tree blossoms and the grasshopper drags itself along and desire is no longer stirred, then people go to their eternal home and mourners go about the streets. So he's kind of continuing the illustration here. What do the doors symbolize? Some people say maybe it's the mouth. Others say it could be the ears. I would probably myself lean towards ears because the context would seem to indicate the silence that happens when the doors to the street are closed. So the doors are open. You're obviously hearing a lot of outside noise and different things. As you close the doors, that noise either becomes less or goes away. The sound of grinding fades. The birds' songs grow faint. The sound of the birds. This is another one. There's numerous interpretations of what this means. One of the popular interpretations is that as we get older, we get up at the same time as the first sounds of the birds in the morning. That we're not really woke up by the birds, but anxious to start the day after perhaps maybe what's been we don't sleep as well. So maybe we've had a restless night, maybe we've had a painful night. And so we're anxious to get up and get into the morning. Light sleepers, early wakers. If our hearing is starting to go, that makes it unlikely that, we're being woke up by the singing of birds. So again, it's not real clear. That's just some thoughts on what that could be, what Solomon's trying to get across there. In verse 5, he talks about people being afraid of heights. If we take it literally, we'd probably see this as kind of a universal truth that he's just stated to us real simply, that it's as we get older, our speech and our hearing are dulled. It's difficult to walk up steps. It's difficult to walk up hills and things. Everything just becomes much more of a struggle. We don't have the energy we used to have to do that when we were younger. Our muscles are atrophying. Our bones have become more fragile. They're bowed, they're bent. And so it could be that. It could be they're afraid of falling. And, unfortunately, we see that. We understand that as we get older and our bones get more brittle, that, falling is something that we're trying to be more careful about and avoid falls because we typically get injured a lot more seriously as we get older. When you're in your youth, it's not unusual. You fall, you cut yourself. You get up, you dust yourself off, your mom kisses the boo-boo, everything is good, and you move along, and you bounce back. But when we're older, a fall can be disastrous. It can really have a life-impacting change, just depending on how bad we fall and what we do to ourselves. So, other people look at this as meaning that whoever this is referring to is afraid in all directions. So they're just afraid of everything. Everything is kind of scaring them. But dangers in the streets, that could mean a lot of different things too. It could be something like an obstacle, just something that's in the street that would make you trip, that would make you fall, that would get in your way. It could be people that are meaning to do you harm, being afraid to go out because you're not strong. You look more vulnerable. You're more likely to be be attacked perhaps and you can't protect yourself like you used to do. Or it could just be the physical challenges involved in simple travel, where to go out to make a trip is just a lot more challenging on every front. You can't move as fast. It's a lot more effort. There's a lot more things you have to take into consideration. It wears you out a lot more. All of those things. So all that could be involved in that. Makes a mention of the almond tree blossoms. This one's a little bit easier probably to understand because it refers to the white hair that comes with old age. So when almond trees blossom, their leaves turn snowy white. Their blossoms turn snowy white before they fall to the ground. If you're like me, I think I've skipped most of the almond leaf thing, and I've just gone falling straight to the ground. So my hair forgot to turn white first. It just decided to fall out, but there you go. The grasshopper drags itself along. Thought here would be, it's just kind of talking about how our bodies are breaking down, the deteriorating physical condition that kind of comes with age. It just takes us longer to do things. We can't get to places as fast. We can't walk as fast as we used to. Things that used to be easy for us to do become hard. Hopping and skipping that we used to do kind of give way to shuffling. And I felt like I was shuffling on the ice when I was walking the dog this week, where it's like you can't walk as fast as you want to. Everything's a very careful step, or you have to kind of make, is this icy or not? I can't tell. I'm going to kind of slide across here or shuffle across here. And so kind of using the grasshopper to say in the same way, we just slow down. That's just part of how life works there. Then people go to their eternal home and mourners go to the streets. Thought here is that the eternal home probably speaks more to the duration, the eternal part, versus a specific place. It's a future state of being compared to the under the sun perspective. So life, he's been telling us all through the book, life here is transitory. We pass through it. It really goes fast. When you're gone, it doesn't take too long before you're not remembered. Life's going to go on. The earth's still going to spin. People are going to come after you. All those kinds of things. It's interesting. The term here, eternal home, is only found in Ecclesiastes. This was an interesting thing. One person I was reading kind of had the idea. It said, well, maybe God intended for us to look back and see this in the context of what we can understand now about eternity versus maybe what the limited understanding of Solomon was. So I think that's an interesting way to look at that too, especially if we view this as inspired scriptures. It's one of those things that God knew as people got a better understanding of this further down the road, they'd have a better understanding of this versus maybe what Solomon had at the time. The mourners would be understood to be paid mourners and wailers. That would be their job, is to mourn people at funerals, and they would even prepare for this before a death event to make the loud lamentations in the streets and the places of commerce. And so he's kind of said, so we endure the frailties of aging and the light fading, and then one day death arrives and it all ends with a funeral. So that's kind of the picture he's painted. And again, you go back to the caution sign. It's not really a happy a happy picture. It's very real. In a lot of ways, it's very sobering in a lot of ways, but I wouldn't say it's the most cheerful part of Scripture we've ever seen. So let's move on to verses 6 through 8. Remember him before the silver cord is severed and the golden bowl is broken, before the pitcher is shattered at the spring and the wheel broken at the well, and the dust returns to the ground it came from, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Everything is meaningless. That little phrase that this starts off with, remember him, the translators added that because this is still a continuation of the thought from verse 1 where he said, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. And so he's continuing that thought here. Remember these things. So up to this point, Solomon's been talking about the frailties of old age, and he's encouraged those who are young to live their lives to the fullest before old age comes and the body starts to break down. And the silver cord and the golden bowl more than likely represent a lamp that would hang from the ceiling. The lamp would produce light, so he's using the lamp itself to represent life in this case. And the cord here is interspersed with silver. The lamp itself is made of gold. And just like silver and gold are valuable, life is also valuable. Life is to be desired. The picture he's painting here is that light or life is going to be extinguished at some point. Regardless of how fine or how valuable or how expensive the materials are, it's still going to be extinguished at some point. The cord's going to break. The bowl is going to fall to the ground. It's going to break. The oil in the lamp in the bowl is going to spill out. And at that point, the lamp doesn't have a purpose anymore. The lamp is no longer useful or functional. So its usefulness has been nullified, you might say. He uses another example to illustrate kind of this same truth. He uses the pitcher and the wheel. And he uses some different symbols. So the pitcher would hold water from the well. So in this case, water would be the symbol that he's using to symbolize life. The broken pitcher, if the pitcher's broken, it kind of makes the well useless because you have nothing to get the water out of the well with, to transport the water with. If the wheel's broken, it's going to prevent you from being able to even draw water out of the well. So kind of the same thought. We get into verse 7, maybe gives us a little bit more insight onto his intent in using the illustration of the cord and the lamp and the pitcher and the wheel. He says, "The dust returns to the ground it came from, and the spirit returns to God who gave it." So he's talking about death. He's illustrating the end of life. And throughout Ecclesiastes, he's talked about how life is transitory in nature. Chapter 3 and 20, back when we were back in chapter 3, he also made the comment that all men and beasts come from the dust and all return to the dust. He says, "And the spirit returns to God who gave it." So he started the chapter referring to God as the creator, the one who made us, and now speaks to the spirit returning to God, the one who gave it. So in other words, the one who owns it. And it's interesting here because in this case, Solomon has distinguished the spirit from the body, and he speaks about the spirit returning to God. And so he's encouraged the young to live in light of accountability for how they live, to live righteously, and it kind of sets up the question, how are you going to live before that day comes? Verse 8 is not new to us. We've seen it throughout the book to this point. Some scholars think the fact that he inserted it at this point is showing his belief that he sufficiently demonstrated the idea of meaningless and serves as the lead into the final thoughts of the book. So you can we can each decide if that's what we think it is, but that seems to be one of the thoughts, is that this is kind of like him putting the bow on the end, that, I've spent all this time, I've spent all these examples just trying to kind of show you all the different ways that we might consider to say, what is life under the sun? And all throughout there, he keeps coming to the same conclusion, that it's all meaningless, it's all empty, it's a vapor, it's like the wind, it's hard to grasp. And it's kind of saying, so now I've kind of brought it here to this point. I'm going to kind of try and wrap it up with that and kind of take you to my final conclusion. The interesting thing, we talked about the Spirit and some of the distinctions he made. And remember at the beginning of class, I made the comment that we'll see him kind of speak in some terms that we haven't seen throughout the rest of the book. And I think this is one of them, because most of the stuff he said before about after we die and what happens and things have not really talked specifically to the fact of the Spirit or the Spirit returning to God in those different things. So it's almost like this is opening up a little bit, maybe his understanding, or he's taking a little bit different place than he has in this up to this point. Start in verse 9 through 12. Not only was the teacher wise, but he also imparted knowledge to the people. He pondered and searched out and set out in order many proverbs. The teacher searched to find just the right words, and what he wrote was upright and true. The words of the wise are like goads, their collected sayings like firmly embedded nails, given by one shepherd. Be warned, my son, of anything in addition to them. Of making many books there is no end, and much study wearies the body. So at this point, it feels like Solomon has defended and supported to them that everything is meaningless, that he's kind of made that point. He's bringing everything to a conclusion. He kind of sums up the methodology that he's been using and his objective in writing the book. And in verse 9, he reiterates his wisdom. And we remember he was in a position of authority, and because of that, his authority, his wisdom were respected, they were accepted. And he talks about how he shared his wisdom, that he was teaching others, and he used Proverbs to teach. The word for Proverbs here, we could translate that as maxims, parables, allegories. And some people believe that he may actually be referring to what we know as the book of Proverbs. Verse 10, he talks about how he gave careful consideration to what he wrote, the words that he used. It's interesting, if we look at some of the things Solomon said in Proverbs, Proverbs 25, like apples of gold in settings of silver is a word spoken at the proper time. Or in Proverbs 8, all the words of my mouth are in righteousness. There is nothing crooked or perverted in them. They are all straightforward to him who understands, and right to those who find knowledge. And so what he wrote was upright and true. And so we look at that and we understand that to mean that he is writing sincerely, that he's speaking from his heart as honestly as he could, but he's also trying to speak objectively, to be factual and not have bias in what he's writing. And so, if you think, I don't know, sometimes if you do the same thing, I know sometimes at work if I'm writing an email, I laugh at myself because it's like, man, that took me a long time to write, but the reason it took a long time to write is because I'm doing something similar. I'm thinking real careful about how I word something, how it might come across, how it might be interpreted. I'll probably go back and change a few things, or I'll read it a few things. I don't like that. I'm going to say it this way, or, oh, I made a mistake here. I'm going to change that. He's basically saying this isn't flippant. I kind of poured over all of this. All these things that I've been writing, I've been teaching. I put a lot of thought into this. I've kind of sweated it out. I've worked hard at this. Verse 11, the words of the wise are like goads. We may not know what a goad is, but a goad is a stick or pole that's got a sharp point on the end of it. And they used to use it to prod oxen or sheep in the direction that they wanted them to move. I guess maybe it's similar to what we might think of as a cattle prod, but that's how they got the herds to go in the directions they wanted to go. They're collected sayings like firmly embedded nails. The collected sayings of the wise, it could be referring to the material that's here in Ecclesiastes that he's already shared with us. It could be a more broad interpretation. Like firmly embedded nails or well-driven nails. So the image of the nail is most likely used because of the nature of nail to penetrate what you're nailing it into. You can usually penetrate fairly easily. It could mean to plant or to drive in, to fasten and secure. So the idea being that the words of the wise kind of nail down the truths that change lives and change destinies. He makes the statement given by one shepherd. A lot of thought there is that should be interpreted as a claim to inspiration. That the words of the wise, their collected sayings, have one source, one authority, with God being the shepherd. And we could find, there's multiple Old Testament references to where God is referred to as the shepherd. Verse 12, the use of my son, probably suggests more of a teacher-student relationship there. He's not talking about a father-son relationship. But it implies that the wise words that he's been giving and sharing and teaching, which come from God, they're for everybody. It's not just something a father is sharing with his son, but it's a teacher sharing broadly with anyone and everyone. There's a phrase there of making many books. This is meant to be kind of in contrast to what we would probably think of as sacred scriptures. It's referring to the thinking and writings of men outside the realm of divine inspiration. So the warning isn't about studying or that studying is bad. It's just the warning is more about those books or writings that contradict the truth or that could lead you away from the path of righteousness. Some people look at these 4 verses as kind of a mini commentary on the book, explaining the how and the why of what Solomon in his wisdom did with his words and explaining what his intended effect for us was supposed to be. But from there, he takes us into the final 2 verses. Now all has been heard. Here's the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. So now Solomon is kind of taking all this and he's moving to his conclusion. And there have been parts of this book, you'll remember, where we just talk about it's not always easy to interpret exactly what he meant. The language is difficult. The illustration he's using may not be as easy for us to understand or as relevant to us to understand. But in this section, his final observations are pretty clear and pretty straightforward. There's not a lot of ambiguity around what he's really bringing us to in terms of his final point. When he says the conclusion that if we went to the literal language, it means the sum of all. So we could be thinking of that as the sum of Solomon's instruction that he's given throughout the book, kind of an epilogue of everything that he's investigated, that he's shared with us, that he's been looking into. If you think about the book, it's followed Solomon's investigation into what gives meaning and shape to a properly ordered life. He started the book talking about, we kind of shared there some of the terms he used, what's profitable, and he kind of equates to almost like a business equation. What can I do to end up being in the black at the end of my life versus being in the red? And he finds through the whole thing that all these things he's tried, he really hasn't had any success. He talks about all of his various pursuits, his interests, the highs and lows that are common to the human experience. But in the final analysis, he concludes that what matters most is living in harmony with God's intention for man. After going through all that and all these things, that's kind of where he lands. The word that's translated fear here means to fear, to reverence, or to honor. If we look at the context to kind of try and understand what he's meaning here, or what would make sense, it's easy to understand it as identifying God as the one who should be held in reverential regard, highlights his unique and supreme position as the being whose wishes one must be concerned with. This whole thought reinforces that link between proper reverence for God and the subsequent righteous behavior that we would expect to happen if we had that proper reverence. It highlights the benefit of listening to the Creator and following the precepts that he's outlined for us. And so respect toward God is demonstrated by living in a way that conforms to his teachings. This is the duty, this is the responsibility of all mankind, or in other words, humanity, a timeless truth that he's put forward here. He ends it with talking about nothing's going to escape the review and response of God. Nothing we think, say, or do. Some things are very visible, can be highly publicized, widely witnessed, while other things we do aren't witnessed by anybody, by any human. Nobody knows, but God is aware, and we're accountable. Sometimes, the way life works, there are immediate repercussions for what we do, and it kind of happens right away. But there's other times where they're not, because no one else knows what happened. Nobody saw anything. It wasn't observed. And there's kind of the caution there about don't get lulled into a false sense of security just because nobody saw you do it or you think you got away with something, because at the end of the day, he's making the point, God knows it all, and God's going to hold you accountable for everything. The fact that God's going to bring every deed into judgment, Solomon's already established that in some other places. And, we've been talking a lot about under the sun through here, and when he says judgment here, does he mean the same thing? Judgment under the sun, or basically some kind of consequence that would happen to us in our earthly life. But when you look at the fact that Solomon made the comment here that every hidden thing will be brought into judgment, that kind of leads us to believe that he's probably referring to eternal judgment, because if it were some kind of earthly judgment, that wouldn't be possible. If it were an earthly judgment, it could include every hidden thing. So I think this is another one of those parts where perhaps Solomon's view of things is broadening, and he's not so much under the sun, but he's having a little bit broader perspective here, some of the first times that we've seen this. So, in conclusion, it's like after this exhaustive, lifelong examination of everything under the sun, he boils it down to this: fear God and keep his commandments. That ends Ecclesiastes. We've got a few minutes left. What I'd like to do is I'll just share some things that stood out to me. Some different things may have stood out to you, but there's so much here that we could have, gotten from the book. I think at least I did, and so I'll share some of my thoughts, and you're welcome to chime in if you've got some things you'd like to share as well. I think throughout Ecclesiastes we see this, the sovereignty of God in a lot of different ways, and you think about all the different things that he's told us. Human wisdom is limited, that we cannot know or understand everything. He's talked about the laws of nature in several places, and we've seen that they're cyclical, they're predictable, they're constant and fixed. And despite anything we might do, they don't change. They are what they are. You remember we had that point where we talked about where God has made everything beautiful in its time, that God sees the whole picture, and we do not. We talk about sometimes where we're frustrated with things, and we can't understand why is it this way. And we talked about we have a limited view. We can only see this much, but God sees the whole thing. Time is in God's hand. We don't control it as much as we'd like to control it or think we could control it. We don't. We had the chapter where it started where he talked about worship, and he talked about where the importance of worship being sincere and not being hypocritical. And then throughout all this, there's the idea that we were made for more, because he talks about God has put eternity into man's heart. There's a lot of thoughts about how to live that I think we see throughout the book. Kind of says life is brief, it's hard to grasp like a vapor, the wind or breath. We're told several places in here, live life to the fullest, make the most of your opportunities. You only get one shot at each stage of life. Earthly knowledge and experiences cannot ultimately satisfy. You remember, we had a whole exhaustive list of all the things Solomon tried throughout life and all the various things he did, more than, truthfully, any of us could even attempt. But he had those at his access. He had the means and the ways to be able to do that, and yet he still didn't find satisfaction. Success can't save you from the fate of all humans, the certainty of physical death. So no matter what your milestones, your achievements, or all the great things you or I think we can achieve in this life, at the end of the day, we all meet the same fate. We're all going to die. Life's unpredictable under the sun. We plan and we try to understand how things are going to do, but we can't always predict things. Sometimes one event can come and, change your plans for the day or change your plans for your life. And that's part of it. Yeah. Well, that's a duplicate. What have I done here? I duplicated a bullet somehow. Anyway, go to the second one there. Learn to live wisely with the unwise. You talked about so many examples, whether it's an unwise ruler, unwise government, unwise people that were around. We need to learn to live as the wise among the unwise. Don't respond like the fool would respond. Don't work without the aid of wisdom. Don't give too much value to what people say about you. You gave that whole section where you talked about, sometimes we get distracted by that, and if we think about it, we've probably said some things we shouldn't have said about other people too, so don't get too caught up in that. Don't let that derail you. Be on your guard against entertaining evil thoughts in your heart. We saw that in the last couple of weeks. In a moment of weakness, you may be liable to say something that you're going to regret that you said, so don't give that a place in your heart. Talked a lot about godly relationships make life sweeter, that life lived in community is how God designed us to flourish. We saw the thought that all seasons of life are valuable. Enjoy the one you're in. It's best to let go of the past. Worrying's useless. Don't worry about what you can't control. Just do the best you can. Doing something's better than nothing. Enjoy your work. Give it your best. Work hard as if it were your last day of work. We can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in our work. It's a gift from God, so be merry, enjoy life, and God's approval of your labor. Practice charity and benevolence freely. Those who love money, abundance never have enough. Riches bring additional worries that hamper our ability to enjoy them. Death is going to terminate all wealth. A good name and reputation are important. Patience is better than pride. Justice will ultimately prevail. God will set things right in His time. God is the primary source of joy and pleasure in life. Life only has meaning when lived in relationship with God. Everything under the sun is meaningless. We're really not ready to live until we're ready to die. We need to live with the end in mind, but don't let death dominate us or define us. Live in a way that makes old age very beautiful. Live a life that's useful. Make friends. Live a pure and holy life. Don't forget accountability. How will sin look when we're past it and having to look back on it? Will we still be glad that we made that decision? And so the bottom line, fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. And so I've actually run over 2 minutes, so there's a lot of stuff there. I've enjoyed this study. I hope you have too. I think sometimes when you teach, you always benefit maybe more than others do. But I appreciate all your attention and your comments and your feedback. And that's it. Thank you.